First, I want to thank Meg. Where's Meg? Back here for doing that reading. That first reading is very long, so she did a wonderful job. Sometimes when we hear that story, the story of creation from Genesis, sometimes we get all bent in knots trying to figure out its relationship to scientific understanding of the origin of the universe. And sometimes we do this to the point where we miss out on what the story actually has, which is a wonderful poetry and wonderful theological statement. So a little background to the creation stories in Genesis. So there are actually, as I just said, 2 creation stories. There's not just one. Chapter 2 and 3, which we did not hear today, the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of humanity, the entrance of sin into the world. It was written by a source that scholars call J, because he liked to use the word Yahweh to refer to God with. The story we heard today from chapter 1 and a little bit of chapter 2 comes from what's known as the P source, and this is the priestly source, very interested in things like liturgy and ritual. In the second creation story, the one about Adam and Eve, evil enters into the world through human disobedience. But that's not the story in Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, the story is less about evil and more about the role of chaos in our lives. Now, I'm going to explore this because I think this is a wonderful story that has some interesting things, but my point here is not that we embrace P's creation story to the exclusion of other creation stories. I think we can have multiple creation stories in our lexicon. My hope is rather that we are able to imagine it.
Well, tell him she's going to England on Tuesday.
And she's off to England.
By herself?
Friend.
Meeting a friend.
No, sorry, there's imaginatively. Thank you. I actually said it. Thanks, Rhonda, for distracting me. Consider many alternative ways of seeing the world. So there's a little bit of controversy right at the very first verse of the Bible, which I think prepares us for much more controversy as throughout the rest of the Bible. But the very first verse of the Bible has a little bit of controversy in it. Older translations, like the King James and many others, read, and this is probably what you're familiar with in this verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. That's probably what most of us have heard when we grew up. So that way of translating things speaks about God's initial creation, or perhaps as a summary of everything that's to come, something like that. But the NRSV, which we heard read today, follows modern scholarship and looks at Hebrew language in slightly different possibilities, and it has a different rendering, and it throws in one little word which really changes everything. So what we heard read today was, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void. So what this is telling us is basically the context of creation. What's going on before creation? What's the situation when God starts creation? And when God created the world, there's this pre-existing state of chaos. And it seems that God did not create this chaos. It's simply there. And the text is not interested. There's no efforts in trying to explain where this chaos came from. Simply the way things were before God started to create everything else. So chaos is older than creation. And chaos, according to this writer, is marked by 3 basic characteristics: water, wind, and darkness. The King James Version, again, the one that we might be familiar with, tells us the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. This is very beautiful and has inspired much rich theological reflection about the place of the Spirit in creation. And it's a viable translation. But in the NRSV, we heard the wind of God, So the Spirit of God, pneuma, is just wind or spirit. And a wind of God can be an ancient way of speaking about a mighty wind, a storm wind, if you will, a terrifying storm wind. So before God created, this is just the setting here. The writer wants you to imagine this setting. Before God started to create anything, before there was any heaven, any earth, there was chaos, nothing but storm, darkness, and deep water. A situation that's antithetical to existence. Nothing can live in this state of chaos. No life of any sort is possible. The ancient storytellers and their audience, when they thought about this darkness, storm, and deep, it would have been a little bit scary, even terrifying. It had some notes of fear. But then God said, "Let there be light." So here is the first act of creation. In the older versions, of course, the first verse tells us about God created the heaven and the earth. But this, in the new version, is the actual first act of creation. God created light. Now, if I were God, which is never a good idea, but let's just imagine for a second I were God, I might be tempted to simply banish darkness. And Steve said, "Let there be light." And the light was good, and the light replaced the darkness. That's what I would have done. But this is not what God does. God does not destroy the darkness. So I think this is really interesting. What does God do? God separates the light from the darkness. So God both separates and incorporates this pre-existing state of chaos into creation. He does not destroy the darkness, rather he limits or organizes it in relationship to this newly created light. Chaos continues to play a part of creation, but now chaos is limited, as it were, by light. If you listen for it, the theme of separation continues throughout the whole chapter. Everything is separated, ultimately. On the second day, God creates the sky by making a dome, and the writer tells us he separates the water that's above from the water that's below. On the third day, God created dry land and separates it from the seas. So just as with the darkness, God does not banish the chaos of the deep waters, but rather they're built into creation, limited and separated, but still in a place. It has a place. On the fourth day, God creates the sun and the moons to separate the light from the darkness again. So the primeval forces of chaos, those forces that existed before creation, are used as building materials by God to create God's good new universe, new world, which balances light and dark. And finally, God creates the Sabbath, the seventh day, the final creation of God. And God makes the seventh day holy. To make something holy, among other things, means to separate it from the other days. So again, the seventh day is separated. The final act of creating a world of order and chaos is to separate one day out of the other days, setting it aside to rest. And I find this fascinating. There's really no command here, right? There's nothing, but the implication for humans is that the seventh day is a time of rest for us. So if there's a responsibility that God gives these newly created humans, the only thing they're required to do in this brand new creation was nothing. Stop doing anything, resting. That's the one commandment. Sometimes we get things all messed up and out of shape. The ancient pharaohs or the ancient, or their modern counterparts, empires and rulers of the world, CEOs and so forth, usually it's endless work. Work, and then when you're finished that, more work. That's what's required. But the Creator wants us to rest. There's a real contrast between the rulers of this age and God. It's not all about doing and doing and doing and then more doing. And it's interesting, at the end of this story, which was probably told initially as a separate unit, there is no fall. Right? This story does not tell you about the fall. There's no sin. There's no first sin. And over and over and over, God says that what he has done is good, good, very good. But this goodness, and this is the thing that makes, I think, this very interesting, this goodness embraces the light and the dark, the chaos and the order. The chaos has been built into the very fabric of this good new creation. And I think this is true about the world we live in, but it's also true about us. Sometimes our lives are chaos. It feels like nothing but darkness and storm, deep in despair. The first creation story, the one that we heard again read, does not say this chaos comes because of sin or because of a fall. It just simply is something that's mysteriously part of creation. Sometimes order hides in the strangest of places. It can hide in chaos. And sometimes our sense of order leads to chaos. Any way you have it, order and chaos are linked in our lives so that both our world and ourselves carry it with us, both of them, at all times. Order and chaos remain forever connected and forever separated. They're always distinct, but always there, always present. And this raises the question for me, how do we integrate the forces of chaos in our own lives and in the world with the forces of order in our own lives and the world? And I believe the seventh day holds the secret, the key to how to integrate these things, and it's rest, Sabbath rest, stillness, quieting our busy, troubled minds and listening to the Spirit. This it will not banish chaos, but it might show us how to live well with chaos. And sometimes our response when we find ourselves in that kind of situation is to start trying to do something to fix it. And sometimes doing things is exactly what we need to do, but sometimes doing things just makes things more chaotic. It's like standing in a calm riverbed and the mud just by your feet is stirred up. And the more you try to do something to, maybe stamp down the more mud you end up kicking up. The only thing that's going to help settle the mud is just to be still and let gravity do its thing. And it takes time and patience. But its stillness is the key. So we, like the world, are a combination of light and dark, chaos and order. And sometimes, I believe, we are ripped apart in a struggle to do what we want to do, in a struggle to do good. Because failure and sin are there and offer deep discouragement to the point where some people just want to give up. I believe we all want to be good. That's my personal conviction. But when this desire for goodness turns into a demand for perfection, a desire to eliminate the inner chaos, or the outer chaos, if you will, in its totality, then that desire for good can tear us apart. It can become a harmful, destructive thing that we carry about. And I believe today's creation story, the one we heard read again, challenges us not to try to eliminate our personal or collective darkness, but rather to embrace it, to embrace our chaos within and embrace the chaos without. It challenges us, rather than just to fight against the darkness, to accept it, to even integrate it into our lives, while we continue to gaze deeply into the light. The light does not rid us of the darkness, but rather leads us to, with God as a partner, to try and create a life out of both light and darkness, chaos and order, a life which is very good, says God. Very good. And I hope that we can all find a blessing such as this today. Amen.